Hello class. In this video you're going to be learning about TypeORM or TypeORM if you want to save 0.1 seconds, which I do, so I'm going to go with TypeORM. So what is TypeORM? TypeORM is an ORM that works with Node.js or any other JavaScript library or framework or anything that works on the back end of your application. And like any other ORM, it allows us to connect to our SQL databases and manipulate and fetch data from there. And apparently it works with MongoDB as well. I haven't tried it with MongoDB, but I believe them. I'm sure it works. So what's nice about TypeORM is that it's written in TypeScript, and it allows us to use TypeScript straight out of the box without having to configure anything, which is really nice. Of course, it allows us to get all the benefits of using TypeScript, like type safety, autocomplete in our editors, having our editors shout at us if we make any typo that will cause a runtime error, and also like decorators and a bunch of other nice things that come with TypeScript. And of course, which means that we can use also the latest features of JavaScript. So let's actually set up our project with TypeORM, shall we? Alright, so here in typeorm.io, I'm going to go to getting started. Actually, it's the same page. That's just a dead link. That's a bit misleading. All right, so here we have all the features that TypeORM has, which is pretty nice. I'm just gonna scroll through them. And here it shows us how to create a database model, which are called entities in TypeORM. And here, by the way, you have to watch out in the documentary of this documentary. It shows us like two approaches that you can use, or two patterns. And you can use both. The first one is the active record, which is where you use like your entities as models, like kind of like object-oriented, like model, like objects. And the other one is using repositories. What is it called? I think it's here. Yeah, the data mapper pattern. I've never been a fan of this pattern. I've seen it before in other ORMs. I don't like it. I'm just going to use the active record one, and I think it makes more sense when working with actual classes and objects. All right, let's set up our project. So we can scroll down here to installation. It tells us what to install and how to set it up. But we can also use a CLI, which is really handy. So I'm going to do that. So right here, go to using CLI and scroll down. So here it tells us, my wheel is going crazy. So here it tells us to install, not here. Here it tells us to install TypeORM globally. So let's do that. So let's copy that. I'm going to go back to my desktop. I'm going to create a new folder. I'll call this TypeORM-tutorial and open that with VS Code. And I'm going to open my terminal. I'm going to paste that in and install TypeORM globally. And now that it's installed, I can say TypeORM init. And now it will initialize our project and create a bunch of stuff. So we have a source directory. We'll come back to this. We have a .getignore and we have an ORM config. And here is where you put your database credentials to connect to your DB. And also we have some configuration. So we can tell TypeORM where all our entities and migrations and subscribers are. And we can also tell it to, so we can set synchronize to true, which will create database tables based on your entities without having to write migrations. So this is really good in development. And we have logging, which I'll set to true for us to see SQL queries that are ran on our database in our console. I'm going to change, of course, the credentials. I'm going to be using Postgres, so I'll change this type to Postgres. The host is localhost. The port is 5432 for Postgres port. I'm going to change the username to classed because it's my username, and the password to root. Of course, these should match your credentials, so yeah. All right, I'll save this. And here we get a tsconfig, which is standard with TypeScript. It just has some configuration, and it tells TypeScript to build everything into a /build directory once we do build our files for production. And also it tells it to enable decorators because we need to use decorators in TypeORM. So let's go. We have a package.json, of course, which has the dependencies. But I'm going to change two things here. We have tsnode and TypeScript have really outdated versions, so I'm going to update those. So let's open the terminal and let's say npm install -d TypeScript at latest, and also ts-node at latest, and hit enter and let those update. And now I'm going to say npm install to install the rest, And while they install, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so yet. Alright, everything is installed. Now I need to create that database. Actually, I didn't name the database. So here in our ORM config, we have a database which is called test now. I'm going to change it to TypeORM underscore tutorial. So let's create that. I'm going to copy that. I'm going to open PSQL. I'm going to type my password. And here I'll say create database and paste that name and put a semicolon. And there we go. I've successfully created it. I can connect to it. So \c and connect to it. So now I'm in it. Of course, if we do \d, we have no tables yet. So let's change that. So I'm going to open a new terminal. And actually, let's go to our source directory first. So here in our source directory, we have an index.ts where this is our entry file, our main top level file. And here we import reflect metadata. Don't worry about it. This is something you just need with TypeORM. And here we have create connection from TypeORM, which we call, which does exactly that, connects to the database. And then after that, we do whatever we want to do in our database. So here what we're doing is we're importing the user entity and we're creating a new user. So let's look at that entity. So here in entity/user.ts, we have our user entity, which uses these decorators. So we have the entity decorator, which tells TypeScript that this is in fact inheriting from the entity type. And here we have our primary generated column ID, which increments on its own, of course. And we have a first name and a last name columns. Actually, I'm going to replace these with just one name column. So I'm going to here say name. And here we have a column age. I'm going to change this to email. And this is going to be a string. I'm going to add another one. So duplicate this. I'm going to make this role. And to use the active record pattern, we need to extend from a different class. So we need to extend from base entity. Of course, we need to import it from TypeORM. And now let's save this. And if we go to our index.ts, here it's already like complaining because these fields don't exist anymore. So that's pretty nice. So what we can do here is let's actually delete everything inside of here. I'm going to say const user equals new user like this. I'll say user.name equals John Doe. I'm going to say user.email equals john@email.com. And user.role equals, I'm going to make him an admin. And here we need to say await user.save like that. And here I'm going to just console log user created exclamation mark and save. Now to run this, we already have a start script which runs tsnode and runs our index.ts. So that's nice. So we can go to our console and say npm start and hit enter. All right, we get an error. That's interesting. Okay, so this is my bad. Driver package not installed because we need to have Postgres if we're working with Postgres. Here we have MySQL by default. If you're using MySQL, this is not a problem for you. But for me, I'm going to actually uninstall MySQL and install PG to have that Postgres driver. So now if I do npm start, I shouldn't have any errors. All right, that's cool. So it's synced to the database. So it did a bunch of stuff, including creating the table right here. And it actually inserted that user and it said user created. So if I go to my psql and I say \d, we see that we have a user table. And if I say select star from user, actually this is a problem. It's there's a conflict between names between actual PSQL users and this user inside of here. I'm actually gonna drop the schema. So the way to do this, if we go back to the documentation, we can use the TypeORM CLI when we're using JavaScript, but we can also use it with TypeScript using something like this. So let's grab this script from here and let's go to our package.json and let's paste that script here. And I'm going to change it to not use the syntax. Instead of requiring that package, we can use that package straight away. So ts-node and run exactly this. And now if I do npm run TypeORM, it's going to run TypeORM CLI, but using TypeScript, which allows it to be used with our development TypeScript files. So if I go here and say npm run TypeORM and just hit enter. Okay, it's I don't know why there's an error here. So got 0, needed 1. Okay, I didn't pass any options, so that's okay. Let's not worry about it. So here we have all of the commands that we can run. So ignore bin.js, we have schema sync, which allows us to sync the schema, but I can drop the schema. So here I can say TypeORM schema drop, like that. And now it's actually going to drop all of the tables. So if I want to change the table name, I'll go to that entity, the user, and here we can pass an object inside the decorator, and we can set a bunch of stuff here, including the name, which is the name of the table. But if we just pass a string, it's going to infer that that's the name of the table. So I'll pass a string users. So if we go back to our terminal and we run npm run typeorm schema sync, now it's actually created, you see here, create table users. It's actually created that table, but named it users instead this time. Okay, so let's actually start to set up some CRUD routes for our user. Instead of just using this, we're gonna have some express routes. So I'm gonna open the terminal. I'm gonna say npm install express. And actually, I forgot we're using TypeScript, so let's install. Actually, it's cool that I'll install as a dependency, dev dependency. So let's install at types express to have express types. All right, so now if we go to our app, our index.js, let's separate the relative imports from the absolute ones, or the dependency ones. And here let's say import express from express. And let's create our express app. So here we'll say const app equals express, like this as a function. Okay, it's complaining for something. Okay, so it says that Express doesn't have a default import, but we can either do this, so import start a star as Express, or we can also enable that flag. So let's copy this flag, ES module into OP, and go to our TS config and add that here, and set that to true. Save. Now, actually, actually, maybe I didn't need to close it and open it. Okay, that warning is gone. So now we have our Express app. Let's actually use the JSON middleware. So app.use express.json. And now I want to set the first route to create the user. So I'm actually gonna remove this call, or actually keep it. But after we create the connection, we need to start listening. So we'll say app.listen, and we'll use the port 5000. And this has a callback. And here for the callback, we're just gonna console log server up on or at http http://localhost:5000. Save that. We don't need this connection, so we can remove that. And here we'll create our first route. So we're gonna do the usual create, read, update, delete, and find. So for our create, let's say app.post to /users, and this will have a handler, and I'll make it async. So we'll have a request. We can use types as well, so we can make it a type request. Hit enter, and it will import it from Express. And we'll have a response, which is of type response, like that. And we'll do an arrow function. And inside of here, let's actually get the input from the request body. So we'll say const name, email, and role equal request.body. So we'll send these in the request body. So here let's do our try catch. So here, let's actually create this user. We'll say user. Actually, instead of doing all the fields separately, we can say equals user.create. And do an object and pass those fields, so name, email, and role. And don't confuse yourself. This create just creates an instance of the user entity. It doesn't actually persist anything to the database. So here we need to actually say await user.save for that to be persisted in the database. And now let's return that user. So we'll say return res.json, and we'll pass that user. And of course, let's do our catch. So catch error. And if there's an error, I'm just going to console log it, and I'm going to return res.status 500.json. Let's actually return that error during development. We can here actually, to be semantically correct, have a status code of 201 because there's a resource that was created. All right, so let's save. Now let's run that. So let's go to our terminal and say npm start. All right, so we get server up on localhost 5000. I'm gonna open Insomnia to interact with this mini API that we have. All right, so we have some examples from last time that I'm gonna use. So we have the routes that I'm gonna create in this tutorial because I used it in other ORM tutorials. So the first one is the create. So we're gonna send this object and we're supposed to get something similar to this. Of course, we're not gonna have this ID because that was MongoDB. So let's send this, make sure it's localhost 5000/users and it's a post request. So send this. All right, so we get 201 created. We got our user with the ID 1 and exactly what we created. And if we go back to VS Code and we go to our pSQL and we do select star from users, hit enter, indeed that user does exist in our database. So that's cool. So we have the created already nailed down. One thing that I want to add also is timestamps. We don't have timestamps enabled by default in TypeORM. So we go to our entity user. Here we can have some useful decorators. So we could say @create date column, and which imports it from TypeORM, and of course close do parentheses. And here let's call this created @ and this will be of type date. This tells TypeORM to create this as a create date column, which automatically sets it to the current date when that object is created. And now we'll do the same for updated. Actually, not the same, it's a different decorator. So here we'll say update date column, and here we'll say updated @ and that's of course the type date. And of course, make sure they're both imported. And this of course changes each time you update the model. So let's save. Now let's run our app again, which will sync. This will be a good time for me to install Nodemon and use that instead of restarting the server each time. So let's say npm install -d Nodemon and hit enter. I'll go to the package.json and add a development script here. Let's say here dev will be Nodemon, and we're actually going to execute the TypeScript code. So we'll say --exec for execute, and we'll say ts-node source/index.ts. So we're running the same as the start, but using Nodemon so that if we make any changes, it's going to restart our server. So save that, and now let's say npm run dev, and now it's actually started it with Nodemon, and it's persisted. Synced the database, and it's altered the table users and added these 2 timestamps. So that's cool. So now if we go back to okay, let me close. Actually, I'm not going to close. I'm just going to go here. So I go back to Insomnia and create Jane Doe. So Jane @email, and Jane, let's say, is just a user, and we hit enter. We indeed get our user, and we get our created @ and updated @ timestamps, which were created for us. So that's sorted. Now let's create the read endpoint, which gets all the users. So let's go back to our code. I keep going the wrong way. So here in the index, I'm gonna maybe just copy it to save some time, paste it here. So this will be a get endpoint to the same /users, which I realized, oh no, that's fine. So here we don't need any input, which means we can omit the request. And here we, instead of just creating the user, we'll say const users equals await user dot find. And find usually takes a condition, but we don't need any condition because we want to get all the users. And here we're not saving any users, so remove that, and we'll return the users. And the status code should be 200, which is the default, so we can just remove this. So save that, and let's go to Insomnia. And here, let's run this. So it's a get request to localhost 5000/users. So run that. We indeed get our users. So 1 is John Doe and 2 is Jane Doe, and they have their fields. All right, so that's created successfully. So next thing I want to do is, of course, you don't want to expose the ID, and you want your users to have something to use to identify a user by. That was a lot of user, but you get the point. So if I show you an example here in the previous thing we did, in the find endpoint, we're using /users /the ID of that user. But of course, this ID is not an incremental natural number, so it's okay to expose it. So let's create a UID for our users. So we go back, let's go back to our editor, and in the console, so I'll say npm install we need to use a third-party package for this, UUID, and we can install also the types for it because you're using TypeScript. So we'll say at types/UUID and close that. Now let's go to our user. Let's add this UUID field. So here we'll say at column, and this will be called UUID, and it's a string. And you can actually add Postgres types here. We can say type inside of here and say that it's a UUID, so it creates it as a UUID type inside of Postgres. But this doesn't set itself automatically. What we can do, we can use these hooks, or I think in TypeORM they're called listeners. So if we go back to documentation, yeah, right here, listeners and subscribers, we have a couple of events that we can use, like after load, before insert, etc., that we can use to operate certain things on our model. So for example, here they show you a manual way on how to create a created date for yourself. So actually we can just copy this and let's go back to our IDE. And here we can go at the bottom and say at before insert. Of course, we need to import this from TypeORM. And here we have a function. We can call this anything, it doesn't matter. For me, I'll call it create UUID because that's what it does. And here we'll say this.UUID. Let's import the UUID library, or we'll say import. Actually, we need v4 and as UUID from UUID. And here we'll say this.UUID equals UUID like this as a function, which sets the UUID of this object. So if we'll go back, actually, if we go back to Insomnia, and actually, let me make sure it's synced. Actually, my server is not even running. So let's do npm run dev. Okay, we get an error. So here it says, okay, it's because the previous data didn't have any UUID, so that creates a problem. So if I go to PSQL and just say delete from users, delete all the users, that should solve that problem. So if I just restart the server, all right, so it syncs properly because that is set by default to not be null. And if you had previous fields that had null there, I mean, they would have had null when that is created, that column, it's going to error out. Okay, let's check if this is actually working. So if we go, where is the Insomnia? It's here. So if we go to create, and now we create Jane Doe again. Let's say we change the Jane Doe to be an admin, and we hit enter. There we go. We get a UUID that is automatically generated for us. So that's cool. We are now using the listeners to perform different things on different life cycle events and places during the creation or fetching of models. Okay, let's say we wanted to remove the ID from the response, which we should because this should not be exposed. So what we can do is in our model, we can override something called toJSON, which is the default method that allows us to return our object as a JSON. So here we can say return, and we can do the spread operator and spread this, which refers to this instance, and then we can set the ID to undefined. So save that, and now if we go back to Insomnia, and we can, if we create another user, so here is John because we don't have John right now, and we run that, we indeed get our user back, but without the ID. So that's one way of removing those fields. And of course, the same goes for the read endpoint. Now the ID is obscured or hidden or like removed. So let's create the rest of the endpoints, which include updating and deleting and finding specific users. So here we have update, which we need to send an ID and send the fields that we want to update, and it should actually update that row in the database. So let's go back to our index.ts file. So here on the update, we can say app.put, which is going to be a put request for updating. And this will be to /users/ let's do colon to pass a parameter, say UUID. And then here, let's do async request of type request and response of type response, and do an arrow function. And here we need to get the UUID from the request parameters. So we'll say const UUID equals request.params.UUID. And we also need to get the data from the request body. So we need to destructure name and email and role equal request.body, just like we did earlier with the create. So let's do our try catch block. So if we get the get an error, and also here in our in our try, we'll say const user. So we need to find the user first before we update that user. So we'll say await user, and we can use find or fail, or find one or fail, and we'll pass it a condition, which will be just UUID being that UUID, which means we can just do this. So of course, if it fails, it's gonna throw an error. And if it doesn't fail, that means this user exists. So let's update that user. So you can say user.name equals name or user.name. So if we give an empty value or a null value, it's just going to set it to the previous value. So it doesn't actually set it to undefined. So let's do the same for email, and let's do the same for role. And now, of course, we need to say await user.save. And here, let's return that user. Return res.json user. And here, if we get an error, I'm just going to console log it, console log error, and return res.status 500.json, and we'll say error, something went wrong. Now let's actually copy that and give it up here. It's better for production to not expose your actual error. Save. Now let's go to Insomnia and try to do that. So if we read, we get all the users. And let's say we want to update John and make him just a user instead of an admin, and also change his email. So let's take his ID and go to the update. So that will be to localhost 5000/users/ and paste that UID, make that a put request, and in the JSON body, and change his email, not to my email, but to, let's say, john@gmail.com. And the role is now changed to just user. So Control Enter. And there we go, we get John Doe, and the email has changed to @gmail, and the role has changed, and of course the updated @ has changed because that's changed because it's updated. All right, so the update endpoint is done. So let's do the delete. So delete is simple, you just pass the UID, and then it should delete and return a deleted successful message. So I'm gonna copy this. I'm gonna go to the delete and paste that. We do the same, we get the UID, and then we don't get anything from the body. And then here we say user equals, let's delete this, find one or fail by UID. And then once it finds it, we need to say await user.remove. And now here we return res.json, and we'll say message user deleted successfully. And we can be semantically correct and say.status status 204, which means this resource doesn't exist anymore. And here, if we get an error, we just say something went wrong. All right, let's test this. So we go to Insomnia. Let's take John Doe's UID, paste, copy it, go to same root /users/ paste that UID, make it a delete request, and execute it. Okay, so we get cannot delete this. So the route was not found. So that's because, okay, I forgot to change this to delete. So the method should be delete. All right, let's try that again. Execute that. Okay, we get no body was returned. I think when you return the status code, the body is omitted. Okay, so I wanted to be a smart ass, but apparently you can't return a body with 204. But it worked successfully, because if we go to check in our database and we say select star from users, we see that John is gone. Or actually, I could have just executed the read endpoint. All right, so the John is actually gone. All right, now we just have the find, which is very simple. We just get a one object or one instance or record, and we return it. So again, I'm going to copy this. I'm going to make it into a get, and it's going to get that with that UID. It's going to find that user, but instead of removing the user, we're going to just return that user. So status code 200, or which is nothing, and the JSON, we just pass user. And this, we know the error, if there's an error here, that means we just didn't find that user. So we can actually set this to 404. Of course, you can check what the error says and here return different responses, but that's a bit besides the scope of TypeORM itself. So I'm gonna just do like a simple error here, and maybe this will be user, and it will say user not found. All right, save that. Let's try to run that. So in the find, We have only Jane, so let's find Jane. Of course, the difference here, we have an array of users. Okay, let's create John Doe again. Of course, in read, we get all of them. And in the find, and if we paste that UUID and we execute this, we get only Jane as that sole object instead of an array of users. All right, so the endpoints for users are done. Let's actually create posts, which is a different table that includes posts, but that are like created by users. So here we have the first endpoint, which is you specify the ID of the user, and then the title and the body of the post, and it creates it and returns it for us. And it also creates this slug, which is automatically generated from the title. So let's actually create that. So if we go back to our IDE or editor, let's go to our entities and create a new one. So here I'll create a post.ts, and I'm actually going to copy the user. They're very similar. They both have a primary generated column ID, and here instead of name we'll have a title, and instead of email we'll have a body, and here we'll have, okay, we're not going to have a role, and we're going to have a UID as well. Okay, you know what, I just realized there's a lot of similarities between the post model or the entity and the user one. So there's a lot of repetition. So what we can do, we can actually create a new one here. And to avoid confusion, I'm going to call it model. So say model.ts. So what this will do is I'm going to create an abstract class that our entities will extend to have all the shared functionality. So here I'll say export abstract class model, and this will extend the base entity, and this imports it from TypeORM. And let's open that. And we're going to have these shared fields. So if we go to our user, let's cut the ID and take it to model. And also let's go and cut the UID and the timestamps, cut them and bring them to model. Of course, we need to import these decorators and import column and import created date and also updated date. And I think there's also, yeah, in the toJSON, we need to hide the ID for the post as well. So cut that. Actually, this as well, this listener. So cut both of these. Basically, just leave the fields in the user and remove the imports here. They're not needed anymore. Here as well. And also for UID. Let's go to the model, paste those in. Of course, we need UID, so we can import that. Okay, what is it doing? Okay. I thought it's going to import it anyway. Let's import it manually. So we'll say import v4 as UUID from UUID. All right, we have before insert. Let's import that from TypeORM and save. And now if we go back to our user and we'll say import model, which I can make it the default export from here. So export default abstract class. And here we can just say model without curly braces from the same directory model. And now we just extend that instead of the base entity, which means we should remove this from the imports. All right, so now our user file is so clean, and now we can do the same in post, just extend the model, import that, and now we don't need any of this, and also base entity and the timestamps, the before insert, and entity as well. We don't even need this. Actually, no, we do need entity, sorry. We need entity for here. So here we need to change this to posts, and we need to remove the ID, and we need to actually rename the class to post, remove the UID and the timestamps and the before insert listener, and also the toJSON. All right, so you see now our entities are so like lean, but they also have all the fields and functionality that is shared, all like abstracted in this abstract class. So now we can run our sync, or actually we can just run our server, which will actually just on its own restart it. So that's created the posts. So if we describe posts here in our database, we see that we have our post table, and it actually has the ID and all the other fields, and it also has the fields that are specific to the post. So that's a nice thing that we can do with TypeScript. So let's actually start to create these posts and fetch them. So we go back to our index.ts, let's create those two endpoints. So what do we have? We have a create and a read for posts. So go here, let's say create a post, and also read posts. So this will be an app.post, to/posts, and we'll have async request of type request and the response of type response. We'll do our error function, and here we'll say const. Of course, we don't have authentication, so we're just going to obtain the user UUID from the body. So we'll say user UUID, and the title and the body equals request.body. So let's create this post. So here we'll say try const post equals, or actually I just realized we need to find the user first, because if there's no user we need to error out. So it's basically this. So let's copy that, paste that here, but instead the UUID needs to be user UUID. Of course, we don't get that user, we get an error, and we need to catch that error. And we'll just console log that error and return basically the same as this. Well, actually, not the same, but I'm just going to change this to 500 and say just error and say something went wrong. Now, if we do have the user, let's create the post. So you can say post dot. Actually, let me show you another way of creating posts. So we can use constructors. So we can go to our post model and have a constructor. And here, because this inherits from a different class, we need to call the super. Of course, the constructor takes some data. So here, let's say it takes a title and a body. And we can give them types. Title will be of type string, and the body will also, of course, be of type string. And when we do get them, we'll say object.assign to assign them to this instance. Of course, we assign them to this, which is this instance, and we'll pass this object with title and body. So now we can use this syntax. So we can say const post equals new post, and we'll just pass it what we need to pass it. So now it's suggesting to us we have a title and a body. So we say title and body like that. And actually, I just realized we need to actually add details about the user in the post, because the post belongs to a user, which will be a good segue to relationships or relations in TypeORM. So here you can go to the documentation, almost said documentary again, and you can find all the relations. So we're interested in many-to-one and one-to-many, because one user has many posts and every post belongs to one user. So here we'll see the example here. So here, for example, a category has, actually this is many-to-many. So let's look at, can I click on this one-to-many? No, this is not clickable. This is clickable. Cool. All right, so here we get the photo has a user, and the user has many photos. So this will be a good example to just copy. So let's copy this. Let's go back to our editor, and in our post, we can just paste this here. Of course, import that decorator. So here, this is the first kind of, what is it called? They call it, so yeah, type function or target, and then there's the inverse relation. So here, this returns a type user, and let's import that from our user entity. And then in the user, we can say this is the inverse. So for the user has user.posts. And then this is a user of type user. This doesn't exist yet, but we'll create it. Actually, for many-to-one, the inverse relation, I think, is optional. Yeah, we can just omit that. So let's set up the other side of the relation from the user side. So we could just go here. We see the user has one-to-many to photos. So we can just grab that. Go back, go to our user here, just paste that here, import one-to-many decorator. So here it returns a type of post, and import that from our post entity. And for the user, or the post rather, we return post.user for the inverse. And here we'll have posts as an array of post entity. So let's save. Now let's look at our output. Okay, we cannot read property title of undefined. Okay, I'm just gonna make this a generic object. So I'll just say model, and then just give it a question mark, meaning that it could be null. And here I'll just make it a partial of any object. So I'll say partial, and then give it a type of any. Actually, this is generic, so we can use it for both. So we can just cut it from here, and then save this, and we go to our model entity abstract class and save that here. And then here we can say, so assign this and assign the model. And this is any, and this is model. All right, so now in anything that extends this model, we can use a constructor and pass it anything. So here in our post, it's not gonna complain. So if we check our output, yeah, it doesn't, and we check our database and we do select, or actually just \d posts, we see that there is here a user ID, which refers to the user. So this is a foreign key that refers to the users table that connects the post to the users. So that's cool. So for us to actually tell TypeORM that this post belongs to this user, we simply pass the user itself as an object, and it will take from it whatever key it needs. So now let's actually save this post. We'll say await post.save, and then return that post, return res.json post. All right, save that. Let's test it out. So go Insomnia and go here to create posts. Let's grab an ID from here. Let's grab Jane Doe's ID, or UUID rather. Keep saying ID. So here in the create post, let's give a user UUID and then paste that there. And oh, where did I click? So here title should be like hello from Jane. Not should be, just like any title, doesn't matter. So here the body will say the body of the post. Very creative. All right, so execute this, and voila, we get our post with the timestamps, with the UUID, with the title and the body, and with the user object as well, returned with it. Now, if you fetch this post on its own, it's not going to return this. It's only returning this because we actually added it like this here. So the post is being created successfully, and it's actually adding the user ID. If we check here, we select star from posts. We get this one post, and it has a user ID of 3 because that's Jane's user ID. So we go and check, select from users. You see that Jane has an ID 3. So this post is indeed linked with Jane. Let's create another endpoint for getting all posts along with their users. So I'm just going to copy that and paste it here. This will be a get to /posts. We don't need any input, so we can omit that. And here we don't need to fetch a user. And here I'll fetch, so I'll say const posts equal await post dot find, and here we'll pass not a condition, but if in options we can do relations, and we'll pass an array of relations, and we can pass the user, which is the alias for that relation, which will get the user for each post. And here we just simply return res.json posts. So let's go ahead and see how that works, or if that works. So here if I fetch, so get /posts, and I execute that, indeed I get all the posts, which right now is just one, alongside with their user. And of course the IDs are omitted because that's a part of the default model abstract class. All right, so we're fetching the relation between the post and the user, so that's nice. Let's fetch the inverse of the relation. So let's go, when we read from users, let's get also all of their posts. I'm gonna create another post by John. So let's go here, say John, take his UUID and go to create, paste that here. This will say hello from John at the body of John's post, and execute that. Just create maybe another one, hello again, and I'm just not gonna change the body. So we go to get all posts. We get all the posts like this. So now we want to get the posts as part of the user payload. So if we go back to our IDE, what is this? Okay, let's, so up here, where we find, oh, not here. We can do that here as well, but let's do that for the get users. So here where we find, we can say relations, and then here say posts, and that should work. So let's save and go here, run that, and indeed we get, for Jane, we get her posts, which is just this one, and for John, we get these 2 posts as part of their object. All right, so that's cool. One thing that I forgot to address actually is validation, because if we right now go here, and I think it's gonna work if we create a user with just empty fields, run that, yeah, it does actually work, which of course shouldn't be the case. So we get some nice, actually we don't, validation, we need to import, we need to install a third-party package, which is, I think it was developed by the community for TypeORM, or like similar ORMs. which is class validator. So I think they mention it even in the documentation. Let me check. Yeah, using validation. Yeah, so here it shows you we need to install class validator, and you can use all these nice decorators that add validation to your model. So things like whether the string contains or minimum and max for numbers, etc. And is email. So let's use a bunch of these. So I'm actually gonna go back to editor, go to the terminal, close this and say npm install class-validator and hit enter. And let's go to our, let's start with the user. So here for the name, let's say I want to add a length so length, and open this, and the length is now imported from class validator, and we can give it a minimum and a maximum. So minimum will be 1 and a max will be 255. So this automatically, if we pass a null or empty string, it's going to error for us. And I'm going to do the same for the email. And I'm also going to say at is email for email to check that it's a valid email address. And here for role, we can use default enum type. So here, let's inside the column, let's open an object and say type enum, and then also give it the actual enum itself, which is an array of values. So we'll have user, and we'll have admin, and we'll have super admin. And then let's actually set the default in case it's empty, and this will be of user. So by default, a user is just a user. So let's save this and let's check if it's working. So go back to Insomnia to create. This should give us a couple of nice errors. So let's run that. All right, actually I forgot to run my server. So let's go open the terminal and npm run dev. And let's make sure that we're returning the errors. So in the index.ts, where are we? Post, yeah, here. So yeah, we are returning the errors. Okay, so let's go to Insomnia, execute this. Cool, so we get, all right, so not that cool in terms of like errors, because we only get an error for the enum. It's kind of like, yeah, it's just trying to execute the query, and it's not actually doing JavaScript validation. It's just executing the query, and depending on the first constraint that was validated, it's going to return that error. So if we fix the enum error, so the role is user, actually it creates user with empty name and email. Okay, so let me fix that. What's happening here? Okay, looks fine. Let's look at the example they used. Okay, let's check class validator's documentation. Oh, I see. So you need to import validate and also call validate on your model instance for it to validate it. Okay, there is JavaScript validation. We just didn't call it. All right, my bad. All right, let's go to the index and let's go up here and we'll import that. So import validate from class validator. And here where we post, after we create our user instance, we need to validate it. So we'll say await. It's actually asynchronous. So we'll say await validate user, which actually returns validation errors. So actually we need to make that into a variable. So const errors equals, this is const equals these errors, and we need to check if we have any errors. So if errors dot length is bigger than 0, then we need to actually throw these errors. So throw errors, and here actually where we throw them, yeah, nothing happens, we just return them. So that's all right. And of course, if there's no errors, then actually try to create that user. So save that, and let's go back to Insomnia. And now if I execute this, cool, we do get an array of errors. And the first one is for the name, and it says name must be longer or equal to 1 characters, and another one for email. And for role, if you give a different one, users, which is not valid, we should, but we didn't, get an error for okay, I know why, because we actually I created this Postgres validation. This is actual Postgres database constraint and not class validator validation rule. Let's find that validation rule and search for enum. Okay, so here we have is enum. Okay, so here on top of role, I'm gonna stack this other decorator and say is enum. Let me import it. And here, okay, do I pass it the array? I'm just gonna pass it the array and see what happens. All right, so let's go back to Insomnia, run that. Okay, cool. So that's not a valid value. So if I just say user, it should be a valid value. Cool, we don't get an error. And if I, of course, say admin, we don't get an error. But if I say administrator and execute, we do get an error because administrator is not valid. And if we omit it completely, we don't get an error because it's going to give it, okay, we do. Okay, I think I'm going to add maybe undefined to one of them. So it has to be either undefined or one of these. All right, so execute that. Okay, it's a bit hacky, but it works. And what's more important is that we have the database constraint, so it can never actually be persisted the wrong way in the database itself, even though if our validation errors are not super on point. All right, so name must be longer than 1 characters. So let's actually create one for myself. So Ahmed, and email. Actually, let's make sure that it's validating the email. So Ahmed@howju without .com, run that. We get that this is not a valid email, so which is correct. And the valid email, oops, is this. Oops. So many typos. Execute. Boom. There you go. So Ahmed, and it created me. And man, I'm just a user. I should be an admin, no? All right. So that's validation. So yeah, that's you can go into the class validator and look at all the other stuff that you can use to add some more validation to your models if you need it. And yeah, so let's go. I want to create migrations now because, of course, in production, you don't want to be using sync because that's really dangerous. So let's see how we can do that. Actually, I think it's a command. Yeah, it is a command. Let me check. All right, so npm run. I actually forgot how to do migrations in TypeORM. Okay, so we have migration generator, which looks at our entities and generates a migration file. So before I do that, I'm gonna drop all the database first. All right, so I'm gonna go here, copy. Actually, I didn't even need to copy it. It's not even that difficult. So say npm run TypeORM. What is it? Schema : drop to drop everything. And let's go to our configuration. So ORM config and set synchronize to false to make sure that it doesn't create these tables. And we create them through the migration. So I'm gonna run TypeORM and run migration. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. Generate and hit enter. Okay, there's an error. Migration. Okay, we need the argument n, which is the name of the migration. So I'm just gonna say n create dash like schema. All right. Okay, I know why. It's missing the argument because to forward the argument to an actual script, we need to say dash dash and then do your arguments. All right, hit enter. All right, so migration was created and let's have a look at it. So it's right here. And it actually has the SQL to create. We have this enum for the role, and we have the table posts, and we also have the alteration on the post to add the foreign key, and yeah, also the table users. All right, so to run these, we need to say TypeORM npm run TypeORM migration run and hit enter. And there we go. It actually ran all of that migration. And now if you do run again, of course, it's not going to run it because it knows which one it ran and which one it didn't, because it keeps track of that in the database. Because if you go and you do \d, you see there is a migrations table. And if you do select star from migrations and execute that, you see that the create schema was actually run and there's a timestamp. And if can we reverse it? Yes, there is a down. Of course, we can reverse it. What question is that? All right, so here we can say migration, is it revert? Yes, I actually saw that earlier, it's revert. Cool, so now we reverted it, and if we do, is there status? There should be status. Yes, or there isn't. Okay, it's actually show in TypeORM. It keeps switching text stacks and it's confusing. Show, okay, it just shows that, oh, okay, I just rushed through it. It shows that it's create a schema, and this is supposed to be a checkbox, and if it's checked, that means it's run. So if I say migration run, And now if I say migration show, it should have a tick in there. Yes, it has an X in there, which means it's run. It's a bit smart way of, anyway, I'm not gonna rag on it, whatever, it works, okay? So now our migrations are executed through files, which is of course much safer for production. Speaking of production, of course in production, you shouldn't run TypeScript, you should run JavaScript. So let's actually build out our server. So we can say TSC, or actually if you don't have it installed globally, you can just use a script. We wrote that earlier, I think, yeah? We didn't, so let me do that. So here I'll add a script called build to build the files into JavaScript, which is just TSC because all the configuration is here for TypeScript to know what to do. So here let's say npm run build and hit enter. And there we go, we get a build directory. Let me close this. And we get index.js. Of course, this is generated JavaScript from our models and our migrations. Interesting that it has two create schema migration. Okay, that's interesting, but it works. All right, so to run our JavaScript, we need to actually cd into it. So cd into build and node index and run it as JavaScript. And there we go, we get server up on localhost 5000. Let's test that. Okay, we get something went wrong. A repository found for user. Okay, I've seen this error before, I was expecting it. And that's because in the ORM config, we need to also tell it where to find JavaScript files. So I'm going to copy this. I'm going to put Alt and select all of these and do a comma and paste that. So here for entities, for JavaScript entities, we can look in the same directory because once we run it from here, it should look relative to here. So we'll say ./entity, and instead of TS at the end, we say JS. And actually, I'm just gonna paste that instead of this, and this will be migration, and this will be subscriber, which we didn't create any, but it's not that important. All right, so now it should actually find the JavaScript entities and migrations without any problem. So if we do node index, all right, so you get server up on 5000, and if we execute this, all right, we get okay, and it's actually working. Because if I go and create a different user, I'm just gonna create myself again, hit that. Cool, it actually persists it, and it's actually working, and it's using JavaScript. So that's that with TypeORM. I really like it. It's a bit confusing to get going with TypeScript if you're new to that and decorators and stuff, but once you get the hang of it, it's really powerful. Again, please do make sure to like this video. It does help a lot, and I really appreciate it. And of course, if you haven't, hit the subscribe button and hit that really nice bell so that you get all these amazing videos that I release. So yeah, that's it for this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.